Avi Melamed, strategic intelligence analyst and regional expert specializing in current affairs of the Arab and Muslim war and their impact on Israel and the Middle East. He is also the founder and CEO of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives. Avi, thank you for joining us today. Now, I know you're following the situation in the Middle East very closely. So what updates do you have now that the IDF has confirmed that Sinwar is dead? What does this mean?
Well, obviously, there are many ramifications. I would start with a very short term, saying that this is, of course, a very significant achievement for Israel. But I would say that not less significant in two major aspects. We have to remember that Sinwar, as long as he was in power in Gaza, was a major obstacle on the path of any kind of a deal to release the hostages, because Sinwar didn't have any incentive to do that. So this is one thing. The other thing is that as long as Sinwar was in power in Gaza, he was able to suffocate any kind of opposition, terrorizing others in Gaza, who basically dare to challenge his path and ask for a different alternative path. Once Sinwar is out of the scene, as it is now, it basically could have potential positive ramifications, both in the context of trajectory of a deal regarding the hostages, the Israeli hostages that are being held in captivity in Gaza, as well, maybe, for the ability to start thinking about the day after the war in Gaza, in sense of establishing a new power in Gaza that will be more cooperative and more positively viewed.
Absolutely. You mentioned the hostages. They're very important. We will get back to that. But for a moment, I want to stay on this strategy that we've seen Israel use, killing all of these leaders of these terrorist groups. I mean, they first killed Sinwar's predecessor, Ismail Haniyeh, and then, of course, the head of Hamas's military wing, Mohammed Deif. And these terrorist groups, are they just going to keep replacing their leader? Do you see them as having anyone else left to replace Sinwar, or are they going to finally give in?
Well, there is always somebody else that comes and take power. But in the end of the day, we have to look at some figures and a significant way that they have, either in the context of the organization or the party they are part of. In the case of Sinwar, we are definitely looking at someone who was enormously significant. It's not somebody that is likely going to be easily replaced. Hamas knows that. We have to also remember, take into consideration that as long as Sinwar was in power, he was actually able to dictate a very military line within Hamas, and basically that results in, or was part of an inner power struggle within Hamas, politically speaking, ideologically speaking. So it's not about the lack of people who potentially could come from and refill the place, but in the end of the day, it's understanding that sometimes there are figures that are not replaceable, in the sense that their weight, their role, their impact was enormously significant.
And Avi, you mentioned that the Sinwar was able to quiet dissent, but now that he's gone, would you say that there is growing discontent with what Hamas is doing in Gaza? Is there a growing amount of people who want this all to end?
Well, definitely. You hear voices within the Palestinians in Gaza. You hear voices from the Arab world that for a long period of time have been very unhappy, to put it this way, with Hamas' way, and the fact that Hamas, since taking control of Gaza Strip in 2007, has been dragging Gaza Strip to havoc and destruction, and particularly, of course, after its attack on Israel on October 7. So those voices are definitely existing out there, but I should mention at the same time, there are still voices within the Palestinians that are identifying with Hamas, that are supporting with Hamas. And I think that the biggest question in the end of the day, when you try to look at the day after the war, sort of speaking, one of the major significant questions is what will be the ramifications of the whole, what happened in October 7 and the aftermath. What will be the ramification on the inner Palestinian discussion vis-a-vis the path that the Palestinians want to take ahead? Meaning, are the Palestinians still going to subscribe to Hamas' violent, dead-end street ideology and policy, or are they going to look for a different path that maybe could hold for both of them, for both Israelis and Palestinians, a more positive trajectory? At this point, this is an open question.
Now, Avi, let's talk a little bit more about these hostages there. I want to read a quote from Netanyahu for you real quick. Netanyahu speaking to the families of these hostages. He says, quote, "We have come to terms with Sinwar. This is an important moment in the war, and we will continue with all our might until they are returned." And then he addressed these members of Hamas saying, "Whoever lays down his arms and returns our abductees, we will allow him to leave and live." Your take?
Yes, well, there has been voices in Israel immediately after the news spread that called the government, the Israeli government, to do a move, a gesture or initiative to actually offer people in Gaza Strip who may be holding Israeli hostages to let them go or to bring information that will lead for the release of the hostages. One of the issues regarding the story of the hostages, 101 Israeli hostages still in captivity in Gaza, is that they are being kept in different places. Many of them, or maybe some of them, are being kept not only by Hamas militants, but also by civilians in Gaza. We have precedent to that issue as well. So the question here is not only the whereabouts of the hostages, but not less significant, who holds them exactly, and if they can be released if such an initiative is going to be offered. So I think that this is an interesting Israeli initiative, trying to seize the moment, trying to take advantage of the momentum, and to maybe hopefully result in a situation where people in Gaza Strip, whether Hamas militants or civilians in Gaza that are holding Israeli hostages, will release those hostages, as Prime Minister Netanyahu says, and in return, their life will be spared.
And so, Avi, do you see a positive outlook so far for the hostage situation?
Well, I think that maybe we could say now cautiously there is some slight better optimism, I would put it this way. But again, we are looking at a very convoluted process. But I think that definitely once Sinwar has been moved away from the scene, this is one significant component. And the other thing is that I think that we have also to take into consideration the position of the Iranian regime that has a lot of influence on Hamas. The Iranian regime is interested in ceasefire in Gaza Strip because it wants to achieve immediately ceasefire in Lebanon as well, where the major proxy of the Iranian Hezbollah is in a very dire situation. So ironically speaking, Sinwar was not only holding Israeli hostages, he was also holding Hezbollah and the Iranian hostages, because the Hezbollah said, "I'm going to fight Israel until there will be ceasefire in Gaza Strip." But there is no ceasefire in Gaza Strip. So the war continues and the Hezbollah is in a dire situation. The Iranian regime clearly expressed its desire to have a ceasefire both in Lebanon and in Gaza Strip. That may be an interesting point where maybe the Iranian regime, now that Sinwar is moved away, maybe there is an ability of the Iranian regime to further exacerbate its influence on Hamas, to move forward to such a deal. So that's the reason I'm kind of like saying cautiously optimism, because still there are many moving parts involved. Not all of them are under the control of the Iranians, of course. That's the reason I'm kind of like, relatively speaking, cautiously optimistic.
Absolutely, Avi. Definitely lots of moving parts in this whole situation. Before we leave here, I want to really quickly ask, just in a larger scale, in a bigger picture, where do you see this war going next? I mean, we still got Iran, as you mentioned, Hezbollah as well. Also, this broader coalition of support behind these terrorists, such as Communist China supporting Iran. What do you see as happening next?
Well, look, we are looking at a very significant shift. I mean, some people are talking about it like a totally new Middle East. I wouldn't go that far, but definitely what we are looking right now is a very significant moment, and particularly because of the major fact, and that is that as of now, when you look at the situation vis-a-vis the Israeli-Hezbollah collision, vis-a-vis the Israeli-Hamas war, vis-a-vis the current situation of Iran, as of now, we can see definitely that the Iranian-backed axis of terror that is rather known by the name of the axis of resistance, that axis is quite significantly weakened. And that is a very significant process, because that axis has been playing an enormously significant role in destabilizing the Middle East for the last couple of decades. That axis is responsible for a huge amount of death and destruction across the Middle East. So the weakening of that axis is a good news for itself. One of the manifestation of that, or the potential ramification, is that Once this axis is further weakened, that will enable both Israelis and Palestinians to take a different path, because up until now, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and other proxies of the Iranians were unfortunately able to dictate their radical agenda, blocking any possibility for a breakthrough, a positive breakthrough in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and blocking possibility for stability in the region. So I would expect that with parallel the weakening of the Iranian-backed axis of resistance, this axis of terror and death, we will see further boosting of regional powers and factors that are interested in stability and want to move towards stability. So as for itself, this is potentially a very positive development.
Absolutely. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say we all hope that things get better for those civilians out there. Avi Melamed, thank you for joining us today.